Hey everybody, it's Kim from Read It Again, and let me switch us. And I'm here with Dr. Lisa Yaszek from Georgia Tech, our favorite science fiction professor. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, first of all, Kim, thanks so much. It's great to be here. It's always so fun to do Read It Again events. So, hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Yaszek. I'm a Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies. and all right, now I'm laughing because I'm also trying to read the comments while I'm talking. I'm a professor of science fiction studies at Georgia Tech, and I'm really interested in science fiction as a global language, as a way that we can all talk to each other across centuries and continents and cultures about our experiences with science and society and our hopes for the future. So a lot of my work has actually been in the recovery of women's science fiction, of science fiction by African Americans, by African authors, etc. But I also do work as a cultural historian, where I look at different histories of science and technology as we see them in literature. And so one of the things that I've ended up looking at a lot has been the history of time travel. And I was thinking about this today as I was prepping for this chat with all of you. And I don't even know how the heck this happened, but I know that I had a lot of fun when I was doing James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. I had a ton of fun on the time travel episode, and it must have shown because they asked me to write the chapter. And then after that, all of a sudden, everyone wanted to talk about time travel, and it's a cool subject. So I was excited when I got this opportunity to write an introduction for the 125th anniversary of edition of The Time Machine by Cosmic Press. And it gave me another chance to get to look at science fiction again. And now I get to talk about it with all of you.
Well, welcome. We actually have a time travel expert on staff, but it's me talking to you today instead of Nicole. But Nicole has some great questions that she sent me to pepper you with later.
Wonderful.
I think we're gonna you're gonna talk.
Right.
I'm gonna go away. You have a slideshow for us,
yeah,
which we worked really hard on putting on StreamYard. And then we'll do questions. So everybody stick around and we'll do lots of questions. And Lisa is just such a fascinating talker that you guys are going to enjoy this. So she could be talking about like snails slowly moving across the concrete. And I would find it so fascinating.
I hope you're right. You're talking this up, and now I feel I have a lot to live up to. But you know what? We're going to do 3,000 years of time travel stories in about 30 minutes. So if that doesn't impress you all, I don't know what will.
So we're going to feel like we're sitting in the time machine in the time machine.
Yes.
As everything goes flying by.
Yes, with images spinning by you, just like he sees as well. Absolutely. Good. I hope I have enough images to make you all spinny. Let's see what we could do.
Okay, Lisa, it's all you.
All right, great. So we are, we've got this, we're screen sharing now, right, Kim? Good. Okay, everyone. Wonderful. Hi, everyone. And again, welcome. I'm so excited to talk with you today about H.G. Wells and the history of time travel. My name is Lisa Yaszek. I'm a Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech. And I like talking about histories of different kinds of stories. And so that's what we're going to be doing here today. And like I said, we're going to do 3,000 years of time travel in about 30 minutes. So let's get going. So, you know, why the time machine? Why is this a book that we all care so much about? Because, you know, the time machine is like science fiction itself. Whether you love it or you hate it, everyone has an opinion about it. It doesn't even matter if they've ever read it or even actually seen the whole thing. Somehow they know something about it. It's just one of those cultural and social touchstones we have. And it's one that actually really transcends our own culture. You can talk to almost anyone about the time machine, right? And actually, I would say that this is one of the good things that has happened in a really tricky year, you know, 2020, the 125th anniversary of the time machine. This is an iconic story that ushered in modern science fiction storytelling and gave us one of science fiction's most enduring images, that image of the time machine itself. Now, later in life, Wells was really quick to dismiss his early science fiction as just sensational writing with a dash of social theory. And it is true, you know, that the evolutionary theory that guides the time machine often gets sort of swept to the side, and we get very excited instead about the time travelers' scientific and romantic adventures and through time and space, right? But the time machine also asks us to confront pretty serious philosophical issues, including the tension between free will and predestination, the relationship between memory and identity, and the inevitability of love, loss, and death. And this, I think, is actually why we really love the time machine. And in fact, all time travel stories, really, they let us imagine that we can break free from the grip of linear time and from the chains of history, and to better understand the experience of humanity itself. Now, time travel stories, as I've sort of already suggested here tonight, are as old as science fiction itself, and in fact, much older. I'd say they're as old as culture itself. For instance, the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, and Japanese mythology both offer time dilation stories about humans who spend time in the heavens, and they think they're just there for maybe a few hours or a few days, but when they return to Earth, they find that hundreds and hundreds of years have passed. And these are stories that go back to the 8th century and the 4th century BCE. So these are really stories that have been with us for a long time. Time travel stories get popular again in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I think that's because at that point in time, Westerners in Europe and, of course, the United States are beginning to move into more industrialized and regulated patterns of production and patterns of life in general. And clocks are becoming increasingly important to us. So it's no surprise we think about time and how we might move through it in different ways. At first, what you see in the late 1700s and early 1800s are really time travel stories that happen through prolonged sleep. So a good example of that, of course, is Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle story from 1819. Towards the middle of the 1800s, you start to get tales in which travelers move through time through dreams or through one-off accidents. And these are called time slip stories. And time slip stories like this include Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, where, of course, Ebenezer Scrooge travels through time while he's sleeping on Christmas Eve. And Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where the hero ends up traveling back to medieval England after having a fist fight with one of his employees in the factory where they work. And the employee conks him with a wrench, and he passes out and travels through time. Fortunately for time travelers, the mode of traveling through time changed quickly within the next couple decades. And by the end of the 19th century, all of a sudden we have stories, and a lot of stories, where we're seeing time travel that happens through machines. And I think this makes sense, of course, as I'd already said, because we're moving into an increasingly industrialized and time regulated kind of life. But even more importantly, there are really practical reasons we had to think about time in new ways by the end of the 19th century. Industrial expansion demanded the coordination of train and ship schedules. If people didn't all work on the same timetables, trains and ships would show up in the same place at the same time. And that's clearly not something you want to have happen. So in 1884, the United States hosted the Time Conference. Actually, I think it was called the International Time Conference. And delegates from 26 countries ended up meeting in Washington, D.C. to standardize the Earth's geographical coordinates and the length of the day. Now, I think that this kind of optimism, all of a sudden with this optimism about the human ability to control time, and we see this expressed in all the stories that I have lifted up here, or posted up here. And these are all stories about machines that literally move us through time. So for instance, we have Edward Page Mitchell's The Clock That Went Backwards from 1881, Enrique Gaspar's The Time Ship from 1887, and Lewis Carroll's Sylvie and Bruno from 1889. And all of those stories feature clocks that engender time travel. So as the characters begin to play with clocks, they end up moving through time itself. The most famous story, of course, to come out of this time period isn't about clocks, but instead is about a vehicle. And that's H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. And I love this cover I found here as a sort of steampunk rendering of the time traveler in his time machine. And it's great because when you read the book, it's such a vague description of what the time machine looks like. It really is, I think it opens up a lot of possibility for artists to do what they want with it. And that's something that you see in all the different iterations of the time machine as they're either, illustrated for book covers or made for different kinds of movies. All right. Well, anyways, we'll come back to H.G. Wells in a little bit, but we've got about another 130 years of history we want to get through. So let's move on. Next thing I want to talk about with you is the way science fiction became a distinct popular genre in the early to mid 20th century. And at that point, time travel very quickly becomes one of the main themes of science fiction. And it's interesting, I'm teaching a science fiction class now, and a number of my students are really, really annoyed with time travel stories because they're like, look, it's just not scientific. There's no scientific evidence right now for time travel and no mechanisms by which we're going to do this. And I have to remind them that a lot of times when you're doing time travel stories, it's not just about how could we literally move through time and space, or what kinds of machines could we build that could change our relationship to time and space, but that often science fiction explores scientific ideas and theories, that just as there are thought experiments in science fiction, we have thought experiments in science. And time travel stories are very much those kinds of stories that circulate as thought experiments through both philosophy and science fiction, right? And this is what you see, especially in the early to mid 20th century. You're going to see artists who use time travel stories for a lot of different purposes: to tell future histories of technology and society, to give exotic tours of faraway times and places, and occasionally even to provide an education on the science of time travel itself. And again, often here, it's not so much literally about the science of time travel as scientific ideas and theories that get offered as scientists explore ideas about time and space. And so in particular, two concepts that scientists and philosophers play with that science fiction authors dramatized early on in the 20th century are the butterfly effect and the grandfather paradox. So the butterfly effect is a kind of story that you can use to touch on issues of free will versus predetermination. And a great example of this is Jack Williamson's The Legion of Time, which you should see in your upper left-hand corner. This is a story from 1938 where one man's decision to pick up either a magnet or a pebble results in two very different futures for humanity. Either humans will expand across the universe and conquer all time and space, and of course be rewarded with wings, because what else would you get when you're a super awesome human? Or humans will find that aliens sweep into the solar system and conquer humans and turn them into slaves, and of course we don't get our wings, right? And it's interesting, the guy who picks up either the pebble or magnet is named John Barr. And to this day, when you see a science fiction story where someone has to make a choice between two different futures, now you know that's called a John Barr point, and that's why. All right, that's your cocktail party conversation for tonight. So let's all take a moment to stop and have a sip of whatever we've brought with us, and then we'll move on. So in addition to playing with things like the butterfly effect, classic science fiction authors really enjoyed the challenge of trying to logically resolve the time paradoxes that might arise when humans begin to mess with history. And in particular, they get really interested in the idea of the grandfather paradox, which asks, what if I went back in time and changed a single event, such as killing my own grandfather? And there's a rich tradition of science fiction stories that explore this. One good example is Fritz Leiber's Try to Change the Past from 1958. And that is in the bottom right-hand corner here. It was an astounding science fiction. And this story postulates a law of the conservation of reality, which ends up making history resistant to change. Another story of this sort, and really, frankly, the one that's my very favorite, is Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies from 1959, which is a dizzying tale of a time cop who travels to multiple points in history and undergoes a sex change to become his own father and mother. And what's really interesting, and frankly, my favorite part of the story, is that there's no penalty for this incredible messing around with time, except a kind of perpetual headache. And, eventually that becomes a trope in time travel stories themselves. And if you look that after All You Zombies, almost every time you get a really complicated, crazy time travel story, someone has a headache. And I am convinced this is all a big homage back to Robert Heinlein's story. Now, you'll see that the image I've put up in the bottom right-hand corner here isn't actually from the original story, but instead I'm giving you the cover of the movie of Ethan Hawke's Predestination, which is a really amazing film rendition of All You Zombies. And one of the few times in my life where I'm going to say I think the film version might actually be a tiny bit better than the story. And I almost never say that. So highly recommended. It's pretty cool. All right. Now, today, well, not even today, but really since the 1960s and 70s, as science fiction moved into what we call its contemporary configurations, we start to see that time travel stories get used a little bit differently. That instead of using time travel to explore scientific or philosophical concepts, all of a sudden we're using time travel to rethink history itself and to rethink, well, not just history, but who counted in history and who made scientific and technological history, but also who counts as a citizen of the future. Now, the 1960s and 70s, as many of you already know, is often called the new wave of science fiction. This is an era that was marked by an increasingly sophisticated literary style, an increased interest in political science fiction, and an explosion of new voices in science fiction, many of whom used time travel stories for social and political commentary. So, as many of you probably already know, the number of women in science fiction doubles in this period. Throughout early science fiction history, women comprise about 15% of the science fiction community. By the 1970s, they suddenly comprise about 30% of the community. And even today, somewhere between 30 to 45%, those numbers remain pretty stable. So as women come to science fiction, they're really quick to adapt time travel stories as ways to stake claims for women in the future imaginary. And I have a whole huge list of science fiction stories I'm going to give you at the end of this talk on the last slide. But for now, I would just call your attention to Marge Piercy's marvelous novel, Woman on the Edge of Time. I think it's from 1976. And also James Cameron's two Terminator films from 1983 and 1991. And what I like about both of these is that everyday women encounter time travelers in these stories and realize that they themselves have the power to make choices that will make the future a better place for all, and a future that's different than the ones we've been promised, for better or for worse. And you might remember, I think it's in the second Terminator movie, that at one point Sarah Connor carves the words "no fate" into the table. And I really feel that that's kind of the spirit behind a lot of feminist time travel stories, is this idea that the history of any people is not a predestined one, and that we can indeed change the conditions of our lives, often for the better, by working together. Now, this period, the 60s and 70s, also saw a new generation of Indigenous and African American authors who began to publish time travel stories representing American history in new ways. And again, it's not that Indigenous or African American authors weren't writing time travel stories before this. People of all colors have written science fiction as long as it exists. But in the United States, African American and Indigenous authors often published outside the science fiction community up until the 1960s and 70s. Frankly, they just thought the genre wasn't particularly serious and that their own concerns wouldn't be taken that seriously there. And there's some good reason to believe that. But things change in the 60s and 70s, and all of a sudden you have these cool new authors who are working in multiple genres, like Gerald Visner, whose story Custer on the Slipstream from 1978 follows the misadventures of a modern bureaucrat who becomes unstuck in time when he realizes that he is the reincarnation of General Custer. And then meanwhile, many of you may be familiar with Octavia E. Butler's Kindred, a novel from 1979 that's basically a reversal of the grandfather paradox, in which a modern day African-American woman finds herself transported to antebellum Maryland, where she must help a young white slave owner rape her free Black ancestor to ensure her own birth. All right, so obviously time travel stories from that era can take on some pretty heavy issues. And just so you know, as with all of these subgenres, you continue to see marvelous feminist time travel stories today and marvelous time travel stories by people of color. One that I've read recently that I really love is Annalee Newitz's The Future of Another Timeline, which brings together the battle for reproductive rights, time travel, and the Riot Girl scene of the 1990s. And she even made a Riot Girl video to go with the novel. How can you not love that? All right, but I'm digressing, and let's get back to time travel. So as I noted, in the 60s and 70s, you're going to see a lot of pretty heavy time travel stories, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And in fact, the 1970s, 80s, and 90s witnessed an explosion of time travel comedies across media, because time travel doesn't always have to be serious. Sometimes it's funny. So a few great examples of this include Spider Robinson's Callahan's Cross-Time Saloon series, which ran from 1977 to 2003. And this series is set in a bar for time travelers who pool their diverse experiences to help newcomers solve unusual problems. This sounds like that should be a TV show of some sort. It's cracking me up as I'm reading my own plot summary. All right, other films, of course, are going to include Back to the Future, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and Groundhog Day. These are all movies from the 1980s and 90s that celebrated the possibility that average people might travel to the past, make and then correct a variety of mistakes, and ultimately change the future for the better. We continue to see time travel comedies today, such as the web series Control, in which a hapless office worker uses his computer keyboard to undo past events, and the BBC series Time Wasters, which is really cool and is one of the first time travel comedies about either musicians or people of color. So, and you bring it all together, how much fun is that? All right. Finally, I would note that even though some time travel stories are indeed funny and pretty approachable, time travel in contemporary science fiction remains really complicated. As many of you know, in the last couple decades, artists have been exploring both the promises and perils of time displacement. A great example of this in print is Dan Simmons' Hyperion series, and another one is Connie Willis's Blackout and All Clear Diptych from 2010, which examines, both of these series actually examine how people find new meaning in lives that have been shattered by mysterious intrusions from an unknowable future. A lot of great time travel movies in the 2000s, such as Primer, Looper, and Interstellar. So everything from really small independent films like Primer, which was made, I think, on a $64,000 budget, to Interstellar, which had such a big budget that the physicists working on it were actually able to do real science that they couldn't do at their home universities. And it's great because whether you tell these stories on a big or small scale, they can be really fascinating and really ponder and explore both the good and bad things that might come out of time travel. We also see time travel in best-selling video games such as Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask from 2000, where players have to solve a specific but non-linear sequence of puzzles before the moon crashes into the game world and resets time. You also see it in indie game offerings like Braid, and this is a game from 2008, where players manipulate the flow of time to solve puzzles that will save a princess from a monster, while uncovering the main character's surprising motives for undertaking his quest in the first place. Hopefully you're intrigued and you'll go check these out. Now, of course, finally, we're getting back to H.G. Wells. So one of the reasons I'm going to argue to you tonight that we have this incredibly rich and diverse tradition of time travel stories is because in the 1880s and 1890s, H.G. Wells wrote 2 time travel stories that changed the shape, not just of time travel storytelling, but of science fiction forever. So, H.G. Wells, as many of you know, is often called the father of modern science fiction. But he obviously wasn't always that way. He had to make his name, and he literally made his reputation on his first 2 time travel stories. The first is a short piece called The Chronic Argonaut from 1888, and that was his first professional sale. And then the second was The Time Machine, the 1895 novel that frankly was, it's a remake and an extension of The Chronic Argonaut, and that's the novel that catapulted Wells to fame. Now, obviously, as you guessed by, from my talk tonight, if not from your own just knowledge previously, Wells wasn't the first person to tell a time travel story or even the first person to imagine we'd use machines to navigate time. But I think that we remember him as the father of time travel stories and the father of science fiction because he was the first person to figure out that you could make these stories feel really relevant and really plausible by using a really specific literary strategy. And as Wells always said, the reason that these two stories work so well is because he tried really hard to just introduce one fantastic element into the stories and to keep everything else as real and plausible as possible. And so I think that that's what gets us so excited, is when we read Wells, you have the sense that this could almost make sense. This could almost work. It feels real. So Wells makes time travel feel real in I think 3 or 4 different ways. We'll see here. I'm going to count through them as I'm talking through them. First of all, Wells makes time travel feel plausible by talking about it in reference to the real sciences that fascinated Victorians. And you find this both at the end of the Chronic Argonauts and at the beginning of the Time Machine. You have the lead character suddenly burst out. This is so typical of the time period too. Like just someone stops and gives you all this exposition. But all of a sudden, the time traveler starts telling you all about new theories of time and space, new theories of physical and social evolution. And all of a sudden, you know, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be reading the story this way. And it helps to feel more plausible. And this would have been really exciting to people in Wells's time, because Wells is referring to all these cutting edge, super cool theories that everyone who was in the know was talking about. And so it would have been exciting to read a time travel story that didn't just talk about dreams or talk about clocks, but that was really grappling with the things that felt important to people at that moment. What was the past, present, and future of British society, right? All right. The other reason I think that people love the Time Machine, and I've got the images up here, I think, to prove it, is that the Time Machine is cool. And that Wells is the first person to give us a super cool time machine that felt plausible and relevant, because it was a lot like the new modes of transportation that were all the rage in his own time period. If you go through both the Chronic Argonaut and the Time Machine, in general, the descriptions of the Time Machine, they're very vague. You can do almost anything you want with it. But he does give these sort of brief moments where he describes parts of the time machine, and it's clearly extrapolated from bicycles and cars. He talks about saddles and levers and knobs and wheels. And so all of that together begins to build up this idea that, yeah, you can imagine maybe like a Victorian sled, as we see in this still from the 1960 version of the Time Machine. The other thing that Wells does that's really smart is that, and this is more in the Time Machine than in the Chronic Argonauts, is he provides readers with a sense of what it would be like to sit in the time machine and watch time flying past you. And there are these marvelous descriptions of suns rising and setting in just seconds, and cities being built and crumbling apart. And the time traveler is seeing all this as he's traveling, and he can't stop it and he can't do anything about it. And what's interesting is that Wells was extrapolating from kinetoscopes and other kinds of visual entertainments that were out there at that time. And so again, this would have felt really plausible to people. The way he's describing images flying by is the way that people were starting to see images flying past them in the moment right before movies, or right as movies are becoming a thing. So this idea of images in motion is something that's super cutting edge and super cool, and might have felt really relevant and plausible to people. So that's 2 things. 3 then. Okay, third and finally, Wells builds the plausibility of his time travelers by creating both characters based on media representations of the most famous scientist inventor of the 19th century, Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was all over the newspaper in the 1880s and 90s. And what's interesting is that he was actually represented in very contradictory ways. When people were critical of Edison, and a lot of people were, believe it or not, journalists and other authors would draw on the tradition of the literary necromancer and pull all these quotes from locals in New Jersey about how they were afraid of the high-tech wizard of Menlo Park. And somehow he was like an updated modern Frankenstein. And so what you find in the Chronic Argonauts, our time traveler he's a little bit of a mad scientist. It's sympathetic why he becomes a mad scientist, but he's pretty nuts. And he's very much based on those representations of Edison as a mad scientist or the Wizard of Menlo Park. And in fact, the very first act of the scientist time traveler in the Chronic Argonauts, after he moves into his house in the countryside, is to light the whole thing with electricity, and it freaks out the entire town. They don't know what to do because they've never seen anything like this. So I think that that's a pretty clear clue that the time traveler is indeed an homage to Edison. Now, by the time you get to the novel 7 years later, the time traveler has really changed and becomes a much more positive and heroic character. In fact, he's no longer dark-haired and pale, but becomes a proper ruddy and blonde British gentleman. In these depictions, in the time machine, we really see the time traveler being represented as a kind of problem solver and a heroic scientist. And again, that maps to the other ways that Edison was often depicted in the news. When he was depicted positively, it was always, he was celebrated for his tenaciousness and his problem solving, his innovative problem solving abilities. And that's something you see time and time again throughout both, a little bit in the Chronic Argonauts, certainly in the Time Machine, is the guy is tenacious, like no problem is too much for him. And he's perfectly cool with coming up with the wrong answer. He just sort of shrugs it off and then starts all over again. And I think that that's so striking. And it's something that you see a lot in print science fiction. This is one of the first iterations of what I like to call the heroic scientist. And the heroic scientist is someone who's committed to the truth, even in the face of human extinction. And this is true for the time traveler. The time traveler is pretty sure he's never going to prove to his friends that time travel exists. He's pretty sure he's not going to be able to rescue his beloved Mina from the death that he caused early in a different timeline. But he keeps trying. And in the end, there's this sense that he's heroic because he keeps trying. And it doesn't matter whether or not he succeeds. It's the effort in the face of extinction that matters. And that's what makes us truly human. And that, my friends, is what I have to say to you about the Time Machine. So I want to thank you all for listening here. And I'm going to look forward to talking with you, answering your questions, and hearing your thoughts on H.G. Wells and time travel in general.
Wow, Lisa, you kind of blew my mind there. Like, it's funny because Nicole sent me these whole list of questions. You answered all of them.
Oh,
that's okay. Oh, that's fine. It was really great. So if anybody has some questions, I was rereading The Time Machine, and I was struck by the classism in it.
Yeah.
And how the two societies, and there's the upper class and then the lower class, and the only way that the lower class can overcome the upper class is if they de-evolve.
Right. Yeah. Well, and what struck me when I was doing the research for the introduction for this edition was I had forgotten how very working class Wells was. And he came out of pretty desperate circumstances. His dad had been a kind of famous cricket player. He was the first generation of famous sports people, but then he got wounded really early in his career and was really never able to really work again. And Wells's mom, who had been a servant before she got married, had to go back into service. And Wells was indentured, not once, but twice. And indenture at that time was kind of like slavery. He was sold off to the highest bidder for, however many years. And he really hated it. He had had some education. He wanted to pursue that. He eventually publicly shamed his mom in a kind of nasty way into buying out his indenture and allowing him to pursue a teaching gig that eventually allowed him to go back to school and become a writer. So, it worked out well in the long run, but I think, you can see that Wells carries that with him all of his life, that he moves, right? He's one of the lucky people who moves through the class system, but is never fully comfortable being part of the upper classes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, let's see, what else? What I was going to ask you.
Oh, hey, can I say something else about Wells and the upper classes? So another cool thing I learned when I was doing the research for this, and I wasn't able to put it in my introduction because I had a length limit, is that, and this speaks again to Wells's class issues, I think, is once he got famous, all of the modernist artists, like the high literary artists, like Henry James and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, got really interested in him, and they all became really good friends. And, you know, most of those modernists were from the upper classes. And eventually, well, they all got in, they all loved each other for like a few years. And then they got in these massive fights that apparently like just entertained the public and to no end. And it was really over class things, because Wells was like, you people are losers and you think art is supposed to be useless and do nothing. And they're like, oh, but you're so utilitarian. And why do you think we should uplift anyone with anything? And why should we teach anything? And they really fought over it in ways that those fights actually became the split between what we now call mainstream literature and science fiction. And they were based in this sort of class antagonism and really different class-based perceptions in what you do with literature.
Huh.
Yeah, crazy, isn't that?
We got a question from Bernard here.
Oh, cool.
What do you think is more plausible? Alternate timelines that cannot be changed, or being able to change the current timeline? Star Trek has both.
In my completely unscientific opinion, I'm going to go with multiple timelines. It just, the multiple worlds theories and like that are, you know, sort of suggested by some areas of physics and especially like string theory and stuff, that to me, I feel, I guess there's some links to science in some ways. So that's just my gut instinct. And it might also be because I grew up reading a lot of like new wave time travel stories and space travel. So things like Joanna Russ's The Female Man and Women on the Edge of Time. And so I think just thinking about multiverses makes sense to me, because that's sort of maybe where I come from.
You come from the multiverse?
Pardon?
You come from the multiverse?
Yeah, I do come from the multiverse. It's absolutely, I'm from many futures, not just one future. Remember IO9 used to say we come from the future? I'm from a lot of different futures.
So somewhere out there is a Lisa with a goatee?
I hope so. I hope so. Oh, there's a marvelous movie. I have to, at the end, put my last slide up for people. I have like the 50 best time travel things you should deal with.
Yeah.
But there's a short film. You can go find it on YouTube, I think, called Butterflies and Breakfast Cereal. It's from 2014. It's about 20 minutes long. And it's a guy keeps coming from alternate versions of the future back to his original self, trying to stop him from eating a bowl of cereal that's going to cause basically the end of the world and the fractioning of timelines and things. And every time, so one time he comes back and he looks like the time traveler from H.G. Wells. One time he comes back and he looks like Marty McFly from Back to the Future. One time he comes back and he's like super cyberpunk. And then the next time he comes back, he's a woman. And the next time he comes back, he's a pineapple. And eventually all those versions of themselves are together. And they have to do horrible things that involve eating the pineapple to heal the timeline. It's marvelous, though.
What was that called again?
Butterflies and Breakfast Cereal.
Butterflies and Breakfast Cereal.
Yeah, you can go find it online. Just go Google it. It's cute. Again, I have a whole list of stories. We could either put the slide up again at the end, or we could maybe, if there's a playlist later, put it in a playlist or something.
Yeah, I can do that. I've put a couple of them in the comments, links to our websites for some of the books, like Woman on the Edge of Time and Kindred, and some Connie Willis books. We're big fans of her here.
Oh, great. She's a wonderful, wonderful author.
Say Nothing to the Dog was a big favorite here. Yeah. So what are you reading right now, Lisa?
So right now, what am I reading? That is a great question. I am reading, let me look, I'm going to look up right now because I'm actually looking at my bookshelf, which will remind me of what I'm reading. I'm right at the end of the semester. So in some ways I'm reading nothing. Oh, I am reading something. I'm reading a book called Afro Puffs Are the Antenna of the Universe by Zigzag Clybourne. It's marvelous. And it's the sequel to The Brothers Jetstream. And these are two Afro-punk stories. They're by a Detroit-based author. They're great because The Brothers Jetstream were awesome, but there are all these cool women characters in it. And you're like, but what about them? And this answers all those questions for you. So that's really fun. And right now I'm in the middle of a gigantic space battle. So I can't wait to find out what happens next. So that's what I'm reading for fun right now.
Let's see. I'm putting a comment.
Another thing I had read recently, and I had mentioned this in my talk, was Annalee Newitz's recent novel, The Future of Another Timeline. And it was a really cool time travel story. I think it's a very niche story. I have to say, you have to be into either like the history of reproductive rights or the history of time travel or the Riot Girl movement, just Riot Girl music in general, to really like the book. And if you like all three of those, it's like the best book in the universe. And I got to say, I'm interested in all three of these things. So I thought it was super cool. And the best part about the book is that in this book, it's an alternate Earth, and their Riot Girl movement, it includes all the bands we had, like L7 and Hole and Bikini Kill, but they also have this band called Grape Ape, and it's more of a Latinx band. And what's great is that somehow Annalee Newitz got Grape Ape to come in from their version of Earth and create a video for us, and you can go on YouTube and watch it. And yeah, so if you want to go look, anyone, it's by Grape Ape, and it's called What I'd Like to See. And what's especially cool is, I don't know if you all know this, but Annalee Newitz's partner is Charlie Jane Anders. They were the founders of IO9, which eventually became Gizmodo. And so this is Annalee Newitz's video, but Charlie Jane Anders has a very cool cameo as the bartender. So you got to go check that out.
Very cool.
It's really fun.
So we got some comments here.
Cool.
Oh, David says The Future of Another Timeline is fantastic. A lot of history in it.
Yeah.
And Susan, if you got the ability, and you know Susan, if you got the ability to live in any of the time travel stories, which one would you choose and why?
Ooh. Wow. That is such a hard one. I got to pick ones that have utopian endings in them, right? No, seriously, I've always really liked, actually, it's not hard at all. I know exactly what the answer is. My very first answer to you is, and I might have other answers as I think about it, but my first answer is I would live in the utopian future in March Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time. I can't remember what it's called, Chattapaqua. It's got some name like some East Coast indigenous tribal name. It's really cool. But I would live in that future. I love it. It's one of the first sort of thinking through the possibility of non-binary futures or very gender fluid futures, thinking about the way we can, and like we do now, use science and technology to facilitate finding our true identities, regardless of whether or not they map to conventional narratives of sex and gender. And of course, there's a bad future she travels to in this story too. I would never want to live there. But what's cool is it's about this very hardened and jaded character who, after being exposed to this future that truly makes just literally no sense to her, when she cannot even see it and understand it at first, in the end, she makes this really heroic choice to make sure that future happens. And I think it's really cool. I love like those kind of inspiring stories. I'm all down for it. So I would want to live in that future. And one of the reasons I would, and I keep talking about this right now, is we're in a moment when our pronouns are exploding. And I think, again, that's really neat. As a science fiction person, like, bring it on. It's hard for me to remember them, and I mess up everyone's pronouns, but it's fun to have that opportunity. I like that. But March Piercy proposes in Woman on the Edge of Time, in her utopia, that we should all go by per, P-E-R, per. And that's short for person. And I'm like, makes so much sense. So obvious. I like it because it works easily for his or her. It's really very flexible. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, a lot of science fiction people are into cats, and it makes you sound like a cat because you purr. So if nothing else, like the fact that now you get to be that. And so I think that's a pretty good one. Also, I'm lazy too. One universal pronoun. I'm totally down with it.
Totally. Yeah. Talking about utopia and back to the time machine, I like how when he first gets there, he thinks he's in a utopia.
Yeah. Right. And it's because he sees all of the visual hallmarks of a utopia, right? There are big, beautiful buildings. Pardon?
Checklist.
Yeah, right. Completely, right? Like the industrial slums of Great Britain are gone. Like it feels at first to him like some kind of amazing mashup of the garden cities that architects were starting to imagine at that time, and a sort of longing. It's like neoclassical architecture, but in a sort of garden city setting. Very popular. You see a lot of science fiction authors imagining that at that time. Yeah, and so checklist, beautiful. And then beautiful blonde people Check. Right? Beautiful blonde people not working very hard. Check. Beautiful blonde people seeming to have a lot of food and art and stuff. Check. So yeah, it seems so great at first. And it's only when he realizes that there's no human spirit, I think maybe is the way that Wells thinks of it, and that these are
very dull.
The human is somehow gone. It's really almost a post-human world, and not in the sort of cool cyberpunky way where post-humans are still really like humans, but in a kind of gutted and uncomfortable way, that they're like puppets, right? Shells of humanity.
It's like The Giver, where you think you're in a utopian society, spoilers, and then he starts to see color.
Yep. So I was talking about this with my students. I think that this is a real hallmark of contemporary science fiction. And that, I mean, 1960s forward, that right in classic science fiction, if it was white and silver and clean and beautiful, you knew it was a utopia. If it was black and gray and grimy and dirty, you knew it was a dystopia, right? And ever since Star Wars, that has no longer held true, right? Because the problem is the Empire looks like a utopia, and it's not, right? I mean, personally, I still think Coruscant looks like a nice place to live, and I'm skeptical about this. But anyways, that's just me. But yeah, right. And whereas it's the people in the sort of dusty and grubby and dirty corners of the world who are the ones sort of with this hope, the new hopes for the future. And I think we see that a lot, that, right, the thing that looks beautiful is really not. I bet you there's a million Black Mirror episodes that explore that premise.
We got a question. David is asking for a friend. Do we have Wells to blame for inventing the info dump?
I love that. Yeah. Gosh, that's a really great question that I have never thought about. I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly contributed to the info dump 100%. I think that Wells does the info dump often a little better than, like, for instance, some of the early pulp authors did. And again, that just may have been because he had more writing training than others. And he actually really wrote and rewrote a lot of stories a lot before he published. And you do, though, get the info dumps. At least when the info dumps happen, it's like in the context of a scene in a story, right? So at the beginning of the Time Machine, like, they're eating and they're having they're like a bunch of like cool hip dudes talking about like the things of society that day. So there's some reason, but you do, get those info dumps, right? Where Professor Exposition takes out her pipe and lights it and then launches in for like 25 minutes and what's going to happen. So you do get those. It's actually, Wells gets better at them over time. And that's one thing I really like about this edition of the Time Machine that Cosmic Press did, is if you look at the difference between the info dump in the Chronic Argonauts and the info dump in the Time Machine, like, it's way more sophisticated in the Time Machine. And in the Chronic Argonauts, it comes at the most aggravating point in the story. It's like at the very end, at the dead climax of the story. And it's like, why are we stopping to talk about the fourth dimension now? Like, when we just found out that you've been committing crimes for 15,000 years. Like, wait, no, let's go back to that, And you're like, what? Fourth dimension? Who cares? But by the time you get the Time Machine, and he moves that info dump to the beginning of the book, which is a good idea, sort of get you through the sloggy parts first. But also it's part of like the way he does that trick where he wants to make the world really boring and mundane. So when the fantastic element comes in, it's that much more fantastic. And he's smart that he puts the info dump in the boring, mundane part of the world. Like, they're sitting around having dinner, talking about science. Like, it is boring in an info dump, but it's plausible. And how many of us haven't sat around at dinner and debated time travel? How many of us haven't done that? Come
on. Speaking of the fourth dimension, I love how he describes time as the fourth dimension.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because one of the things I found as I was looking at this, right, is that, obviously Wells, he was trained at, top-notch schools in like the schools that are like, the school that's now the Imperial College of London, essentially. So he really knew like the cutting edge science of his day. He was hanging out with all of the important people. Oh shoot, where was this going? I just lost where. What are we talking about?
Fourth dimension.
Fourth dimension, right? So he knew all that, and he brings that science into the info dumps, as you know. But what's really interesting, and I think is he's also thinking visually about the fourth dimension, right? That Wells was really fascinated by early filmmaking technologies and thought a lot about sequential art, and in both comics and in filmmaking. And he had done a lot of work thinking about kinetoscopes and reading about them. And he's literally importing that into his descriptions of traveling through time and space. So as we're traveling through the fourth dimension, he's representing it, like I said in the talk, visually exactly the way that people would have, for the first time ever, seen the fourth dimension represented to them through sequential art like that. Well, no, I mean, we've always had sequential art, but it was getting very popular again at that point. So I think that's really cool. And in fact, after the time machine came out, I have this in the longer version of the talk, and I can't find it right now. But someone who was working on early cinematography called Wells and is like, "You need to come and work with me, and we're going to think about this together." And so they made an early version of the time machine. But Wells also, and in order to do that, Wells helped them build the very first film studio and the film special effects production spaces. So I think that that's really cool. So he was thinking about film to dramatize time, and then the filmmakers are like, come and help us dramatize time. And then that is part of how we built the modern studio system. So Wells, once again, everywhere, all the time. The man cannot be escaped.
All right, guys, we are rounding it out here at the end. If you guys have a question, it's your last time to ask it. Actually, that's not true, because Lisa lives locally, so we can ask her the question. Right. We have the technology. Okay. So do you want to put up that list?
Yeah, let me share the screen. All right, everyone, here, let me
yeah. And while you're doing that, so the books, you can get it from us. We would love you to support Read It Again Bookstore. If you have a oh, there it is. Very nice. Let's add that sucker in. Oops, back. Let's see. Can I make it bigger?
I make it bigger. I'm going to do that right now.
Okay.
There.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we can get these books for you. Just let us know. We totally order them. We can ship them. We have copies of. I like to see myself when I talk. we have copies of the Time Machine in stock, and we also have Lisa's book, The Future is Female, which is an awesome collection of the. You give us your spiel.
Oh, thank you. So The Future is Female is that's my work doing the recovery of women's science fiction. And it's an anthology of some of the best and most enduring of women's science fiction stories from the 1920s, when science fiction first became a successful commercial endeavor in the United States, to the 1960s, when all of a sudden you have the revival of feminism and the beginning of feminist science fiction. So this is a book that really looks at what was the kind of science fiction that women wrote between the suffrage movement and the revival of feminism in the 60s. And it turns out women were in science fiction writing all kinds of stories, some of which are feminist and some of which are not. And so this is a book that collects 25 of what we hope are the best of these. And I'm excited, Kim, to let you know that I just spoke with Library of America, and we're starting work on volume 2 in next month. So
that's exciting.
Yeah, The Future is Female Forever. I like that title. That's what we're going with. And we're going to focus on just the 1970s. It's such a rich time. And the moment when you start to see women from all walks of life, women from of all different races and ethnicities publishing in the science fiction magazines, and we're starting to think about like cisgender versus trans women at this period, and really embracing a wide variety of feminine perspectives and experiences. So I think that that's going to be super cool.
I am looking forward to that.
Thanks. Yeah, me too.
Let's see here. Awesome list. I think Sound of Thunder was one of the first get the butterfly version of the butterfly effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, it literally is the first dramatization of the butterfly effect. And I think that Bradbury actually is playing with that concept before anyone is actually using the term. The term gets popularized in the 1960s.
Susan says she read that in your class.
You did. That's right. That's a fun story. I like that one a lot.
Let's see. When it comes to the cool factor, what is your favorite visual representation of time travel? I'm partial to the nearly dream time version of Star Trek IV Voyage Home.
Oh,
I just rewatched that.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
I didn't put that in my list. Shoot, good call.
Well,
See, everyone keeps, we got to add things to the list here. It's a very partial list. My favorite visual one, that is beautiful. Gosh, let me think about this here. I'm looking at my own list right now.
I'm like getting closer so I can read your list. I see you have Groundhog Day on here.
Yes, I do. I like Primer. Because what I like is that as they start jumping through time and messing with the time streams in Primer, the timelines begin to unravel, but the characters begin to unravel both psychologically and physically. And I like how the director really reflects that, like in the visuals, as a sort of visual language of the film begins to unravel as well. And it gets really hard to figure out what's going on for a while, but it's perfectly appropriate to that. And again, anyone who can shoot a time travel story on $64,000, how can you not think that that's amazing? Oh, you know what else I like? This is going to sound goofy, but I forgot to put it on here. I like the Futurama time travel episodes. There's the one where they go all the way to the end of the universe and then they drink a 6-pack and then go through the Big Bang. And I love that one too. And I think that there are actually some really, Futurama knows both its science and its science fiction.
You're smart. Yeah.
Actually, some really haunting images, like the image at the end when the three of them, when it's Bender and Fry and the mad scientist, and they're sitting there drinking beer and lounge chairs. I don't know. It's a cool image. I like it.
Yeah, I see a movie that's big in my house, Bill and Ted. We watched the third one when it came out, and I think it was like the highlight of my kids' month. They were just so happy afterwards.
We went and saw that. Yeah, we went and saw it at the drive-in, actually. It was a socially distanced family day with another family, like science fiction, and it was cool to see Bill and Ted. I thought that the women who played the daughters were really good. They really liked the dads. They were fantastic. But
it was a total comfort film.
Yeah, it was cool.
Really, it was like a bowl of chicken soup.
Yeah.
So yeah. Still looking at your list. Okay.
Looking at my list, if I can recommend something off my list, if I was going to recommend anything to anyone on this list, and I think there's some great stuff here, believe it or not, it's towards the bottom on the second side. It's a short 12-minute film by Olga Osorio called Einstein Rosen from 2016. You can go find it online for free. It is, I think, the cutest and most charming and funniest and most unexpected time travel story you will ever see. And I don't want to say anything else about it, except there's a scene with mortadella sausage that's just the funniest thing you've ever seen before. And I don't know what else to say about it. So.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I love nerding, geeking out with you. Anytime you want to come back and do this, you are more than welcome. And you should come visit us because you haven't been in the store since we renovated.
No, I would love to. And you're open again. So if you're doing it all socially distanced and masked up, I'll come and visit sometime. That would be great. I'd love to see what you're doing.
All right, guys.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. And thank you for doing all these online series. I've been tuning in whenever I'm on social media and I see them and they're going and I jump in. And it's so nice to have these breaks. We're all on screens too much, but if we're going to do it, at least let's do some good stuff with art. And I really appreciate the efforts that you and every bookseller is making at this time to make our lives better. Thank you.
Thank you. You literally choked me up.
Oh, it's true though. It's so true. My goodness. What would we do without stories?
Okay, guys, support your local independent bookstore. It doesn't have to be us, but we would love it to be us. Thank you for joining us, Susan. Thank you. I love that picture of you, by the way.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.